Grace Harrison, once the perfect mother and wife, had meticulously planned the destruction of her entire family. On Christmas Eve, as the world celebrated joy, the Harrisons sat down to a festive dinner, unaware that it would be their last. The perfect holiday was shattered in an instant, and the quiet suburban home was soon filled with a chilling silence. Grace, trapped in a web of financial ruin and a crumbling marriage, had chosen the unthinkable path to wipe out her family in a calculated act of murder. What led a mother to commit such an unimaginable crime? It was Christmas Eve, 2017, and the Harrison family was preparing for what should have been the perfect holiday. The house, located in a quiet suburban neighborhood, was adorned with twinkling lights and colorful ornaments that shimmered against the crisp, cold night. A fragrant aroma of gingerbread cookies filled the air, while the fireplace crackled gently in the corner. The Christmas tree stood tall in the living room, its branches weighed down by a generous display of presents wrapped in festive paper. Outside, the streets were lined with glowing decorations, and the neighborhood was alive with the quiet hum of holiday cheer. Grace Harrison, the 42-year-old mother of the family, had spent weeks organizing the Christmas festivities, as she had done every year. With a broad smile, she had overseen every detail of the holiday preparations, from picking out the perfect tree to baking dozens of cookies for the family to enjoy. Her husband, Richard, was an insurance agent, hard-working and reliable, and their two children, Emily and Jack, were the apples of their eyes. Emily, a bright and ambitious 16-year-old, had recently been accepted into a prestigious college program, and Jack, a playful 12-year-old, had a keen interest in science and was always tinkering with gadgets. To everyone who knew the Harrisons, they were the epitome of the perfect family. Grace and Richard had been married for 18 years, a union that seemed steady and strong. They had met in college, and over the years they had built a life together. To outsiders, it seemed as though they were a team that could face anything. But behind closed doors, there were cracks in their once solid foundation. Grace had always been the center of the household, organizing family activities, managing the finances, and making sure everyone was taken care of. However, the pressure was starting to weigh on her. In recent months, Grace had been feeling increasingly isolated. Her relationship with Richard had become strained, as they had started to argue more frequently about money. Though Richard worked hard, the family was facing financial difficulties. The cost of living had risen sharply, and the bills kept piling up. Grace had always been responsible with their finances, but lately she felt overwhelmed by the mounting debt and the looming threat of bankruptcy. To make matters worse, Grace had developed a secret. She had been having an affair with a man named Mark, someone she had met at a local gym. Mark was charming and attentive, everything Richard had stopped being over the years. He listened to her, made her feel important, and offered a temporary escape from the daily stresses of her life. The affair, which had started as a fling, had become an emotional anchor for Grace, and she began to rely on Mark for the validation she felt she was missing from Richard. As Christmas approached, the tension between Grace and Richard had reached a breaking point. Richard had started asking difficult questions about their finances, but Grace had been defensive, hiding the extent of their problems. Richard was oblivious to the deeper turmoil within his wife, believing that everything would work out. After all, it was Christmas, the season of joy and celebration. Little did he know that the woman he loved had been slowly unraveling beneath the surface, her dark secrets festering in the shadows. The family's picture-perfect life, so carefully curated for appearances, was about to come crashing down in the most unimaginable way. On Christmas morning, as the sun slowly rose over the quiet neighborhood, the first signs of something being wrong emerged. The Harrison house, which had always been filled with life and energy, was silent. The twinkling lights on the Christmas tree, which should have been casting a festive glow across the living room, were dark, The smell of fresh baked pastries and cinnamon, which had greeted the neighbors on previous Christmas mornings, was noticeably absent. Neighbors who had known the Harrisons for years began to take notice of the strange stillness around the house. They had grown accustomed to seeing the family up early, excited about Christmas, exchanging gifts, and enjoying a big breakfast together. But on this particular morning, there was no movement in the windows, no children running around in pajamas, no sign of life at all. At first, people chalked it up to the possibility that the family was simply sleeping in after a long night of holiday celebrations. It was, after all, Christmas, a day when many families took the opportunity to relax and enjoy the slower pace of the holiday. By late afternoon, however, the concern grew. The Harrisons had always been the type of family to open their door to friends and neighbors, offering warm hospitality during the holiday season. Yet no one had heard from them. The neighborhood, once filled with the sound of laughter and festive chatter, had grown quiet. The absence of the Harrisons became more unsettling with each passing hour. A neighbor named Sandra, who lived across the street, decided to check on the family. She had always been close with Grace, and over the years they had become good friends. Sandra had stopped by the Harrisons' house just the week before to exchange gifts, and everything had seemed perfectly fine. Grace had been her usual cheerful self, and the kids were excited for Christmas. But now, something didn't feel right. Sandra rang the doorbell, but no one answered. She knocked, calling out, but there was no response. Feeling uneasy, Sandra peered through the window, but all she could see was darkness inside. Concerned, she walked back to her house and decided to call the police. Within minutes, an officer arrived and Sandra explained her worries. The officer knocked on the door several more times, but when there was still no answer, he decided to investigate further. What the police found when they entered the Harrison home was something they could never have prepared for. The front door was unlocked, which was unusual for the family, who had always been cautious about security. Upon stepping inside, the officer immediately noticed how eerily quiet it was. The house, which had once been full of laughter and energy, now felt cold and hollow. The living room, where the Christmas tree stood proudly just hours before, was untouched. The fireplace was cold, and there was no sign of the festive warmth that had filled the space on Christmas Eve. But it wasn't until they entered the family's kitchen that the true horror became apparent. In the center of the room, the Harrisons were sprawled across the floor, their bodies unnaturally still. Grace, Richard, Emily, and Jack were lying motionless, their faces serene and peaceful, as though they had simply fallen asleep where they stood. At first glance, it almost looked like they had drifted into a deep slumber after a long night of celebrating. But the absence of any sign of struggle or disorder made the scene unsettling in its calmness. The only thing that stood out was the overwhelming smell that filled the room, a musty, chemical odor that made the officers' stomachs churn. It was quickly determined that the family was dead. But what had happened to them? There were no signs of forced entry, no indications of violence or an intruder. The house was in pristine condition, aside from the eerie stillness that hung in the air. The officers, confused and disturbed, called for backup, and soon a team of detectives arrived to begin their investigation. As the scene was carefully examined, one thing became clear: something was terribly wrong. It wasn't an accident, nor was it a random act of violence. It seemed as though the family had simply vanished. But the question was, what had happened to them? And why had they all died on the one day that was supposed to bring joy and togetherness? As the police began their investigation, the quiet unease that had settled over the neighborhood deepened. Detectives combed through every inch of the Harrison home, searching for clues that might explain the inexplicable deaths. They found no signs of struggle, no blood, and no evidence of a violent confrontation. Everything appeared perfect, almost too perfect. The family's presents were neatly placed under the tree, untouched. The dinner table, set for the festive holiday meal, remained pristine, with nothing out of place. It was as if the Harrisons had simply gone to sleep and never woken up. But that eerie calmness only deepened the mystery. Forensic experts were called in immediately to determine the cause of death. They found that the family had all been poisoned, though the method was not immediately obvious. The substance used was rare, an odorless and tasteless poison that had gone unnoticed in their food. It was clear that someone had meticulously planned and carried out the crime. The poison wasn't something that could have been accidentally ingested. It had been deliberately introduced into the family's meals, most likely in their Christmas dinner. The detectives turned their focus to Grace, who had always been the glue that held the family together. At first, they had considered the possibility of a tragic accident, perhaps something like carbon monoxide poisoning, but the lack of any other signs pointed to foul play. Grace's background was scrutinized, and what the investigators discovered shocked them. Grace Harrison, the woman who appeared to have the perfect life, had been hiding dark secrets for months. Grace had been struggling financially. Though she and Richard had always appeared to live comfortably, the reality was far different. The Harrisons had accumulated significant debt over the years, with credit card bills, loans, and a mortgage that was becoming harder and harder to pay. Richard had recently begun asking questions about their finances, something that had made Grace nervous. He had started talking about cutting back on expenses, selling some of their belongings, and even asking Grace to get a second job. This had created a strain between them. They argued more frequently, and Grace began to feel trapped, overwhelmed by the pressure of maintaining the appearance of a happy family while struggling to keep their financial problems hidden. But there was more. Investigators uncovered a secret affair Grace had been having with a man named Mark, someone she had met at a local gym several months before. Mark had been a temporary escape from the mounting pressures in her life. He had been the attentive partner Grace had longed for, someone who listened to her when Richard stopped trying to understand. What started as a brief fling had quickly turned into an emotional entanglement. Grace had kept this secret from everyone, including Richard, but as her relationship with Mark deepened, her anxiety over her own life grew. Grace had begun to see no way out. She was drowning in debt, her marriage was falling apart, and the life she had worked so hard to build seemed to be slipping through her fingers. The stress was unbearable, and in her mind, the only solution was to free her family from the struggles she had created. She began to hatch a plan that would end everything, once and for all. She had carefully researched poisons in secret, researching substances that would be difficult to detect but effective in their lethality. She studied recipes for Christmas dinner, knowing that she would need to prepare a meal everyone would want to eat. Grace poisoned the turkey, the stuffing, and the sides, ensuring that the family would consume the deadly substance in the warmth of their holiday gathering. Afterward, she carefully cleaned up, wiping down surfaces and arranging their bodies in a way that would make it appear as though they had simply passed away in their sleep. As the investigation continued, detectives began to connect the dots, and it became increasingly clear that Grace had planned the entire thing. The poison, the careful preparation, and the deliberate execution of her plan all pointed to one conclusion: Grace had murdered her family. But the true motivation behind her actions remained elusive. Was it truly an act of desperation, or was there something deeper, something more chilling, behind the perfect facade of the Harrison family? The more they uncovered, the more chilling the case became, and the question of how a woman who appeared so devoted could commit such an unthinkable act haunted everyone involved. As the investigation into the Harrison family deaths deepened, the detectives began to unravel the chilling truth behind Grace Harrison's actions. Forensic evidence confirmed the presence of a rare and potent poison in the bodies of all 4 family members. It was a substance that was nearly undetectable, one that could easily be administered in small doses without immediate suspicion. The poison had been carefully introduced into the family's Christmas dinner, a meal that Grace had lovingly prepared just hours before the tragedy unfolded. The detectives scrutinized Grace's every move in the days leading up to Christmas. She had seemed like the ideal mother, the kind of woman who was always on top of everything. She had planned every detail of the holiday with precision, from picking out the perfect turkey to ensuring that the table was set just right. The detectives found that she had gone to great lengths to make the day seem like any other Christmas, a day filled with warmth, laughter, and togetherness. But behind the scenes, Grace had been struggling with a mounting sense of dread, her life spiraling out of control. Grace's financial problems had been a secret that she had kept from her family. Though Richard had begun to notice the increasing tension and had asked questions about their finances, Grace had carefully hidden the true extent of their troubles. She had accumulated tens of thousands of dollars in debt, money she had borrowed to maintain the lifestyle the family had become accustomed to. The bills were piling up, and the pressure of keeping up appearances weighed heavily on her. Richard had started to push for answers, demanding that they cut back on spending, but Grace had resisted, afraid of what would happen if her husband found out just how deep their financial hole had become. But it wasn't just money that had driven Grace to the edge. The breakdown of her marriage had been another factor. Richard and Grace had once been a team, partners in life, but over time their relationship had begun to deteriorate. Richard had grown distant, focused on work and unaware of the struggles Grace was facing. The lack of emotional support left Grace feeling isolated, trapped in a marriage that no longer seemed to bring her happiness. During this time, Grace had turned to an affair for solace. Mark, a man she had met at a local gym, had become her confidant, offering her the attention and affection that Richard no longer did. The affair had started as a brief escape, a way to feel alive again, but it had quickly become an emotional anchor for Grace. She leaned on Mark for comfort, pouring out her frustrations, her fears, and her deepest secrets. But the guilt of the affair weighed on her, and she knew that if Richard ever found out, it would be the end of her marriage. She was caught in a web of lies, and the pressure continued to build. In the weeks leading up to Christmas, Grace had begun to feel as though there was no way out. She saw her financial ruin as inevitable, and her marriage, once a source of stability, was falling apart. She had begun to plan the unthinkable, an escape for her family, one where they would never have to face the consequences of her mistakes. The idea of ending their suffering seemed like the only solution, a way to protect them from the consequences of her actions. Grace had carefully researched poisons, looking for a substance that would be difficult to detect but would kill quickly and without pain. After weeks of planning, she chose a rare poison that could be easily added to their holiday meal without raising suspicion. She carefully prepared the Christmas dinner, making sure that every dish was infused with the deadly substance. The poison would take effect in hours, gradually shutting down their systems, and they would simply appear to have passed away in their sleep. After the family had eaten, Grace waited. The first signs of the poison's effects were subtle, but within hours the poison took its toll. Richard, Emily, Jack, and Grace herself began to feel drowsy, their bodies shutting down one by one. When she saw that her family had succumbed to the poison, Grace began to act quickly. She cleaned up, wiped down the surfaces, and arranged their bodies to look as though they had died peacefully in their sleep. She left no signs of struggle, no indication of what had truly happened. When the police arrived, they found nothing out of the ordinary, only the bodies of the Harrisons, lying in their home, as though they had fallen asleep. But as the investigation unfolded, the detectives began to piece together the truth. The methodical planning, the hidden debts, the affair, it all pointed back to Grace. The woman who had once been the heart of the family had destroyed it in an attempt to escape her overwhelming fears and burdens. As the evidence mounted, it became clear that Grace had not only murdered her family but had done so with cold calculation. Her actions had been deliberate, and the facade of the perfect holiday was nothing more than a carefully crafted lie. In the aftermath of the tragedy, the question remained what had driven a woman who appeared so devoted to her family to commit such a horrific crime. And would anyone ever truly understand the depth of the despair that had pushed Grace to take such drastic action? The truth, it seemed, was far darker than anyone could have imagined. The arrest of Grace Harrison shocked the entire community. The woman who had been known as the loving wife, dedicated mother, and pillar of the neighborhood was now at the center of a horrific crime. The news spread quickly, with people struggling to comprehend how someone so outwardly perfect could commit such an unthinkable act. How could a mother, someone who seemed to care so deeply for her children, plan and carry out the murder of her entire family? The town was left in a state of disbelief, with many unable to reconcile the image of Grace they had known with the woman who had killed her loved ones. Grace's trial became a spectacle. The courtroom was filled with reporters, curious onlookers, and those who had once called Grace a friend, all eager to understand how someone so normal could commit such an atrocity. As the evidence was presented, it painted a chilling portrait of a woman who had been living in a prison of her own making. Grace's defense team argued that she had been driven to her actions by the overwhelming pressures of financial strain, marital problems, and a desperate need to escape the life she had created. But as the prosecution laid out their case, the true horror of Grace's crime became undeniable. Forensic evidence revealed that Grace had meticulously planned the murders for months. She had researched poisons, choosing one that was difficult to detect and would kill without causing immediate suspicion. She had prepared a Christmas dinner for her family, knowing they would all sit down together and consume the deadly meal. It was clear that this was no spur-of-the-moment act. Grace had carefully orchestrated every detail, from the timing of the poison's effects to the way she arranged the bodies afterward. She had made sure that everything appeared to be a natural, peaceful death, a family lost in their sleep on a quiet Christmas morning. But as the trial continued, the true motive behind Grace's actions began to emerge. The financial troubles that had been quietly eating away at her were just the surface of the pressure she had been feeling. Grace had kept her debts a secret, hiding them from Richard and her children, terrified of the consequences if they were to find out. Her marriage to Richard had grown increasingly strained, and she felt more and more isolated. The affair with Mark, while offering a temporary escape, only compounded her guilt. She had found herself caught in a vicious cycle, unable to find a way out. In her mind, the only solution was to end the suffering not just for herself, but for her family. As the defense team tried to argue that Grace was a victim of her circumstances, the prosecution countered with evidence of her calculated actions. Grace had not acted out of desperation or emotional breakdown. She had made a choice. She had chosen to murder her family rather than face the consequences of her mistakes. The notion that she had done it out of love for her family was rejected by the prosecution, who argued that love would never lead someone to commit such a brutal act. The most disturbing part of the trial was Grace's lack of remorse. Throughout the proceedings, she remained eerily calm, offering no explanation for her actions other than a vague admission that she had been overwhelmed by the pressures of life. She never once showed the kind of regret or grief that might have been expected from a mother who had just killed her children. Instead, she seemed detached, almost as if she were describing someone else's tragedy rather than her own. To many, this only added to the horror of her crime. How could someone so seemingly loving and devoted turn so cold? In the end, Grace Harrison was convicted of all charges, including 4 counts of murder. The jury deliberated for only a few hours before reaching their verdict. The sentencing came shortly after, with Grace being sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The courtroom was filled with a sense of finality, though the questions surrounding her actions remained unanswered. Was Grace a woman pushed to the edge by the overwhelming weight of her responsibilities? Or was she a cold, calculating murderer who took advantage of her family's trust to orchestrate their deaths? The community, still reeling from the shock, was left to grapple with these questions, but the answers would never come. Grace Harrison had taken the ultimate step in her bid to escape the crushing pressure of her life, and in doing so, she had forever shattered the lives of the people she once loved. as she was escorted out of the courtroom. There were no tears, no cries for help. There was only the quiet realization that Grace Harrison, the woman who had wiped out her entire family on Christmas Eve, would spend the rest of her life alone, her actions haunting not only her own future, but the future of everyone who had once known her. The town would never forget the nightmare that had unfolded behind closed doors, a Christmas that had been meant for joy and togetherness, but instead became a symbol of the darkest betrayal imaginable.